Whether you call it rubbernecking, being a tourist, or a gawker, we all know that feeling of seeing a terrible vehicle accident or crash from a distance, and then slowing down to have a good look as we approach the scene, contributing to the growing size of the surrounding crowd. It is just natural for us to be curious about something that could potentially be horrifying. We're going to examine two stories that involve a large number of people doing just that, moving as close as they could to see an enormous fire, or getting right up next to the windows in their homes to get a better look, having no idea what the burning vessels contained. The lucky ones learn their lessons after suffering only minor injuries, but the unlucky ones, well, we're about to learn a very important lesson from them today.
This is the end, beautiful friend. This is the end.
Greetings, kittens. Welcome to the Podcast of Doom, the podcast devoted to epic failure analysis. I'm your host, David Appleson. Today we will look at two cargo ship disasters. One in Halifax, Nova Scotia, was Canada's worst industrial accident, as well as North America's. The other in Texas City, Texas, was the United States' worst industrial accident. Both were carrying highly explosive, volatile chemicals that were the cause of the disaster. In Halifax, the cargo was packed with safety in mind, but important rules regarding right-of-way in the harbor were ignored. In Texas City, the ship was in port at the time of the accident, but important rules regarding the safe handling of explosive materials was lax. We are going to talk about cargo in this episode, cargo and the transportation of it. The SS Mont-Blanc, which exploded in the harbor just outside of Halifax, was carrying more than 4,000 tons of cargo, most of it explosive or flammable. The Grandcamp in Texas City was carrying 2,300 tons of cargo, most of it explosive or flammable. But it took a lot of developments just to have the technology that allowed us to put that much cargo, explosive or not, into one vessel and transport it thousands of miles across the sea from where it was produced to where it was needed. The trading of goods goes back more than 100,000 years, when isolated tribes of people put down their weapons long enough to trade objects of value to other tribes lacking those objects but possessing objects craved by the first tribe. At first, trade was limited to whatever could be carried by people. But along with the domestication of animals came the advent of the pack animal. We start seeing the first boats used for trading around 4000 BC. Eventually, rafts and canoes were used to transport larger quantities of goods than pack animals, using rivers and seas as trade routes, and cities began to develop at the crossroads of trade routes. The Romans improved on existing designs, constructing a two-level bireme, and trade reached new heights under the Pax Romana, or Roman protection of trade routes. The Romans built ships deeper and wider to accommodate more cargo. Borrowing innovative ideas from ships built in Northern Europe, the caravel was a major leap forward in cargo ship development. Here we see the familiar flat decks that raised the surface for the sailors and provided better protection for cargo. Trade took a big hit in Europe in the aftermath of the fall of the Roman Empire, but the slack was picked up in the Near East and Far East. During that time, better sails were developed that reduced the dependence on favorable winds while improving speed and maneuverability. Arab and Chinese ships used more masts, and more masts meant more speed and better use of available winds. And the triangular shape of sails changed to a square shape, which allowed them to make even better use of the winds. Meanwhile, the construction of the Chinese junk had progressed to a point that the craft was stronger, bigger, safer, and built to take greater advantage of the wind than that of its Western rivals. However, the European powers did add some new ideas that improved capacity that came from their contact with Muslim trading cultures during the Crusades. Trade and exploration really took off under the guidance of Prince Henry the Navigator of Portugal. He formed a school of navigation in 1418, training ship captains to navigate by the stars and to map wind patterns for future expeditions. He sponsored early exploration of the west coast of Africa and formed Portuguese colonies there and on the islands in the East Atlantic. Along with popularization of the compass, European nations were now ready to explore the other side of the Atlantic, and Columbus's expedition to the Americas would take place in the same century in which Henry formed his school of navigation. When trade became global and thus more competitive, the need for larger and faster ships became a necessity. Masts continued to grow in size and number, allowing ever greater cargo capacity. The Spanish and Portuguese were the first to develop these larger ships called galleons, but those nations were soon in competition with the Dutch and English. As piracy picked up, so did the need to travel in convoys or fleets of ships, with some ships designed specifically for attack or defense. 17th century shipping was dominated by the English and Dutch, and to a lesser extent the French. But crews were also growing larger and more expensive to maintain. Competition between the Netherlands and Britain culminated in the Anglo-Dutch War that Britain won and initiated that country's dominance of the seas and sea trade well into the 20th century. Map-making had also improved immensely during this time, with the coastlines of most of the continents well charted. The North American colonies played a huge part in the British Empire's dominance in trade, providing raw materials and a marketplace for their goods. Following the American War of Independence, Britain and the United States became keen competitors, and this competition led to further advances in shipbuilding as trade ships became ever faster and larger. In 200 years, the time to cross the Atlantic by boat had decreased from 66 days to 23. 20 years later, the trip had been cut down to 14 days or even less. The onset of the Industrial Revolution led to an exponential increase in manufactured goods, leading to more ports, more consumers, and bigger and faster cargo ships. The last of the great sailing ship designs was probably the clipper, which emphasized speed over cargo capacity. A clipper could make the trip from China to England in just 90 days. The advent of steam-powered engines spelled the end for wind-powered ships. Due to the heaviness of the engines, the first steam-powered ships were slow and had a tendency to cause coastal erosion in narrow rivers. Paddle-wheel steamboats could only be used in the widest of rivers, and it took some development to get them to move faster than a horse and cart. In 1819, the American-built Savannah was the first steamship to make the transatlantic crossing from Savannah, Georgia to Liverpool, England. It took 27 days, but you have to start somewhere. The second trip took the Canadian Royal William from Quebec to Isle of Wight in 17 days, and the era of the steamship had begun. Steamships would not only haul larger amounts of cargo than ever before, they were bringing millions of Europeans, fleeing revolutions during the 19th century, to North America. Iron hulls and steam turbine engines were the next great development, and steamships in the Cunard Line were reaching sizes of up to 650 feet in length. In 1912, the Titanic was built, and as the name implies, it was a behemoth. 882 feet long, 93 feet wide, and 104 feet tall. Her registered weight was 46,000 tons. It could hold 2,400 passengers and 900 crew, and still have space for all of their luggage and other cargo, not to mention fancy period furniture, brass fixtures, and the musical instruments for that famous band. It did, however, move at a comparatively slow speed for an ocean liner, and that slowness and the need to make up the speed would contribute to its undoing. We are now up to date for our first story, the ship explosion at Halifax. Canada entered World War I on August 4, 1914, the same day as Britain, due to Canada's status at the time as a British Dominion. Canada mobilized for the war and ramped up its army and navy for the cause. Located in the coastal province of Nova Scotia, Halifax, with its relative proximity to Great Britain, had always been an important harbor, and as North America was a prime source of raw materials, it was a strategic port for delivering the goods in demand during Britain's many wars. It was also a major hub for rail lines, as rail transport was still the best way to move cargo across land in the early 20th century. The Royal Canadian Navy was founded in 1910, just a few years before the war with Halifax, as a major command center. But the RCN was still dependent on the British Royal Navy for most of its needs. The harbor itself offered many natural protections and was easier to defend than other similar ports along the coast. German U-boat or submarine attacks were of a particular concern throughout the war. In response to that threat, by 1917, there was a growing naval fleet in Halifax, including patrol ships, tugboats, and minesweepers, and a large number of vessels from Allied nations. The population of Halifax at that time was 50,000 people, and that of Dartmouth across the harbor was about 15,000. There were often numerous soldiers and sailors housed there during the war, as Halifax was a major center of embarkation and debarkation to and from the war in Europe. A major hospital had just been established to treat the wounded. All of these factors contributed to Halifax being one of the busiest ports on the North American Atlantic coast. The 3,121-ton French cargo ship, the Mont-Blanc, was an older vessel, and although it did not move quickly, it was still reliable for transport. She was on assignment to join a slow-moving convoy due to her speed limitations, but had reached Halifax too late in the day to enter the harbor as the anti-submarine nets had already been raised. Creeping steadily up the coast from New York City on a mild December day in 1917, her captain, Aim Lemedek, was joined by a local pilot, Francis Mackey, when they got close to port. It was a procedure at that time that vessels of a certain size have a local pilot who knew the ins and outs of Halifax Harbor. During the examination period, the port authorities discovered that almost all of the Mont-Blanc's cargo was high explosives, 3,000 tons of wet and dry picric acid, TNT, gun cotton, and highly flammable liquid benzol. The port authorities had no protocol for handling such hazardous cargo, as they were still relatively new at this, and the contents of the ships were treated the same as other ordinary cargo ships. Because the nets had been raised, Mont-Blanc was ordered to remain in the harbor until dawn the next day, December 6th, at which time it was to proceed to the Halifax Channel, often called the Narrows, and move north into Bedford Basin, where it would hook up with the rest of its convoy. Already waiting in Bedford Basin was the Norwegian vessel the Imo. The Imo was headed toward New York City to take on relief supplies for the beleaguered civilians in German-occupied Belgium. She spent the day of December 5th waiting in the basin for a supply of coal that was used to power the steamship. The coal did not arrive before the harbor nets were raised, and so the Imo had to spend the evening in the Bedford Basin. There the two ships rested for the night, the Mont-Blanc, fully loaded with explosives, at the south end of the harbor, waiting to go north, and the Imo, completely empty, at the north end of the harbor, waiting to go south. At 7:30 on the morning of December 6th, the anti-submarine nets were raised and the Mont-Blanc received clearance to proceed into the channel. She was traveling at 4 knots, or about 5 miles per hour, 1 knot less than the speed limit, headed toward Bedford Basin. At that time in the morning, most of the harbor commanders had not reported into work yet. At 8:10 a.m., the Imo received clearance and began making its way out of Bedford Basin, also toward the channel, but from the opposite approach. Her pilot was William Hayes, and her captain was Håkon Fromm. The basin was crowded with ships, either waiting for their turn to leave or waiting for their convoys to assemble. Hayes had to wind his way through this crowded seaway. The Imo had already been delayed waiting for the coal fuel, and Hayes asked his engineers for more speed. The ship approached the Narrows at 7 knots, 2 knots above the speed limit. Entering the Narrows, the Imo approached the American tramp steamer SS Clara, approaching from the wrong side of the channel. Southbound ships were required to travel along the west or Halifax side of the channel, while northbound ships were required to travel on the east or Dartmouth side of the channel. Hayes could clearly see the Clara approaching his vessel from the wrong side of the Narrows. Further south was the Mont-Blanc, about 20 minutes behind the Clara. Hayes grabbed the Imo's steam whistle and blasted it once. He was signaling to the Clara that she was on the wrong side of the channel and she needed to correct her course. The pilot of the Clara, Edward Renner, answered with 2 whistle blasts. It was a negative response, which Hayes correctly interpreted as the Clara wanting to pass starboard to starboard, or both ships passing on each other's right side. Technically, this was an illegal move, but pilots experienced in navigating the Narrows understood that sometimes the rules needed bending to get through the tight passage. Hayes blasted back 2 times, agreeing that they would pass starboard to starboard. The main effect of this maneuver was to put the Imo on a path closer to the Dartmouth side, the wrong side for channel passage. But the Imo was already behind schedule, and Hayes did not want to bring the ship to a complete halt. He would be able to correct course after passing the Clara. As the 2 ships drew parallel, Renner called up to the Imo's bridge. "Keep a good lookout. There's a ship coming astern." A thick mist was covering the Narrows, and Renner was warning the Imo of the Mont-Blanc steaming up from behind. Hayes recognized Renner and acknowledged the warning. Just prior to this, the wrecking tugboat, the Stella Maris, was pulling out of dry dock on the Halifax side with 2 heavily loaded scows or barges in tow, heading in the direction of the Bedford Basin. With the length of the Stella Maris, the 2 scows, and the rope in between, the tugboat was taking up more than 400 feet of seaway and moving slowly to prevent getting tangled. The Stella Maris was making a slow journey to the Dartmouth shore. Stella Maris captain Horatio Brannan commented to his crew that the Imo was going as fast as any ship he had ever seen in the channel. Meanwhile, the Mont-Blanc had drawn abreast of the British cruiser HMS Highflyer, which was moving across the channel. To avoid her, the Mont-Blanc maneuvered closer to the Dartmouth shore. Mackey, pilot on the Mont-Blanc, could just now make out something beyond the Stella Maris. It was the 4 mastheads on the Imo. At this point, the 2 ships were about 3/4 of a mile apart. Hayes and Mackey had spoken the previous day. Mackey knew that the Imo had missed getting out of the basin that day and was eager to make up for lost time. Mackey also noticed the foam ripple coming out from her bow or front. The Imo was moving toward him faster than the allowed speed. It was now apparent to people on shore and on other vessels that the 2 ships were on a course headed toward each other. Mackey let out a single whistle blast to get Hayes' attention. He told Captain Lemedic to slow down the Mont-Blanc. Lemedic translated the order to his crew in French. With the Stella Maris now safely out of their path, Hayes and Imo Captain Fromm could clearly see the Mont-Blanc heading towards them. The whistle blast from the Mont-Blanc indicated that the French ship had the right-of-way and that the Imo needed to move. Normally, the ship sending out the first signal is assumed to be in control of the operation. The Imo responded with 2 short, sharp blasts. The Imo was going to go toward the port or left side, closer to Dartmouth and right into the Mont-Blanc's path. It was a stunning response, and it drew the attention of many dock workers who suspected that something was not quite right. Mackey knew that the Imo was empty, and that meant sharp turns would be difficult, if not impossible, and both ships were headed into a tight section of the Narrows. The Imo wanted to pass starboard to starboard with the Mont-Blanc, the second time that day it would perform that ill-advised maneuver. Lemedic ordered his crew to stop the engines and turn the ship starboard toward Dartmouth. Mackey let out another whistle blow, indicating that he wanted the Imo to pass to his starboard or Dartmouth side, putting the Imo dangerously close to shore. The Imo returned the request with 2 short blasts. The ship will maintain its present course. Sailors from other ships began to take notice, congregating along the harbor to see what was happening. It was at this moment that both pilots took appropriate corrective action. The only problem was, those 2 corrective actions ended up negating each other. Both ships had cut their engines and were continuing towards one another just for momentum. Mackey feared that if he intentionally grounded his ship, the sudden vibration might set off his explosive cargo. He therefore chose to go in the other direction, turning sharply to port or toward the Halifax side of the Narrows. He hoped to cut across the Imo's path before the 2 ships struck each other. At the same time, the Imo let out 3 sharp signal blasts, indicating the large ship was reversing engines. That appeared to be an appropriate maneuver that would have given Mont-Blanc more time and space to pass by. But with an empty hold, the Imo's propellers produced a transverse thrust, which happened to swing the vessel strongly to starboard towards Halifax and towards the Mont-Blanc. Now the Imo's bow was headed straight for the side of the Mont-Blanc. There was no time for either ship to correct course. Both crews knew a collision was imminent. On board the Mont-Blanc, Lemaitre initially thought he had just avoided a catastrophic collision with another vessel, but he realized the worst of his fears when the Imo reversed engines and took an unexpected turn toward his ship. The captain quickly determined there was no way to avoid getting hit by the Imo. The only question was, where would it hit? Lemaitre knew the most dangerous cargo aboard was the TNT in hold number 2. The TNT was highly unstable, and the Mont-Blanc was transporting a huge amount of it. If he could direct the bow of the Imo away from hold 2, he might prevent an enormous explosion. Lemaitre gave 3 short whistle blasts. "All astern," Mackey shouted, and Lemaitre translated the order into French. The Mont-Blanc was going to reverse its engines. For 30 seconds that must have felt like an eternity. Lemaitre and Mackey stood on the deck of the Mont-Blanc as the bow of the Imo headed straight for the midsection of their ship. At 8:45 a.m., the Imo punched a 9-foot hole into the side of the Mont-Blanc at close to a 45-degree angle. Both ships shuddered at the impact. Herbert Whitehead, commander of the drifter CD-73, docked on the Dartmouth side, witnessed the mid-channel collision. He remembered a crashing, rending sound. "I can hardly describe it," he said. As though, well, you can imagine how iron will crash with iron with a rending sound. The Imo did manage to miss cargo hold number 2 on the Mont-Blanc. Instead, it had impacted against cargo hold number 1. When the Imo's reverse engines finally kicked in, it produced a great flash of sparks from metal striking metal. Those sparks landed on a few grains of picric acid crushed during the breach. The combustible acid burst into ant-sized fires. These might have burned out on their own had some of the barrels of benzol not ruptured. When the benzol vapors hit the picric-ignited fires, it instantly flamed into a larger fire. This might be a good time to discuss the contents of the Mont-Blanc's holds. TNT was developed as an explosive starting in the 1860s. Its popularity outgrew that of picric acid, the other commonly used explosive at that time, because it was more stable, easier to produce, and cheaper to manufacture. However, during World War II, the British fell behind the Germans in TNT production and made up the difference by producing more picric acid. Picric acid was developed in the 1880s and was less than ideal as an explosive. It was difficult to detonate, particularly if it got wet. It frequently misfired, was difficult to use, and created a thick black smoke which interfered with aerial observations. It was so unreliable and dangerous that it was banned on U.S. railroads. Gun cotton, invented by the Germans in 1845, was essentially cotton fibers soaked in explosives and then dried. If the strands of fiber were first crushed into a pulp, it made gun cotton reliable, stable, and incredibly flexible. It could be molded into whatever shape was needed for a job, much like modern C4 explosive. Benzol is a type of chemical used mostly as a fuel. In liquid or vapor form, it is extremely flammable. The crew was well aware of the dangerous cargo they were carrying and made adequate preparations for its travel. However, they could not have prepared for a T-bone collision with another cargo ship. The anchor of the Imo had been stuck inside hold number 1 of the Mont-Blanc. It had caught onto 2 solid plates of steel. When the reverse engines finally pulled away, it created the hail of sparks which eventually set flame to the leaking benzol. The excited crew of the Mont-Blanc was gathering around the bridge, waiting for orders from Lemaitre. Flames were already starting to appear on the deck. The crew was cut off from their fire hoses, and they could not even reach the anchor to attempt to keep the burning boat from drifting. Lemaitre asked Mackey if there was any last action he could take. Mackey replied, "Take care of your lifeboats." That was it. Lemaitre gave the order to abandon ship. The crew got into their lifeboats in a quick but orderly fashion. The steering wheel was locked down, and the Mont-Blanc was left to burn in the middle of the channel. After much coaxing, Lamedic was the last to leave the ship. Momentum kept the large vessel at a slow, plodding course for Pier 6 near the populated district of Richmond in Halifax. The Imo appeared from the shore to be following close behind the Mont-Blanc, but it was actually having trouble correcting its direction after pulling out of the Mont-Blanc. There was disagreement on the Imo about what cargo the Mont-Blanc was actually carrying. The Imo's bow showed no sign of hitting any cargo, so why were the crew abandoning ship? In the city of Halifax, people outside of the immediate harbor could see great billowing black smoke rising up from the Narrows. Benzol smells like petroleum when it burns, so the common belief was that it was an oil fire. Many children and their families preparing for a day of school stopped what they were doing and went to their windows or even the docks to see what was going on. Sailors and stevedores were picking out prime viewing spots either on roofs or near the docks. The spectacle of the fire was bringing work in the area to a standstill. As the crowd of spectators grew ever larger, the unmanned Mont-Blanc continued to drift. By the time she came to a complete halt, she was parallel to Pier 6 on the Halifax side of the channel, and so close that some of the wooden pilings on the pier ignited and burst into flame. Pier 6 was one of Halifax's busiest commercial piers. The Imo attempted to head back to Bedford Basin, but encountered difficulty turning around in the narrow channel, and instead resumed its original course out toward the open ocean. The crew of the Mont-Blanc headed for the closest shore in their rowboats, which happened to be on the Dartmouth side. As they disembarked, the crew members tried to warn the sailors on other crafts that a munitions ship was about to blow. But either because they could not hear or they could not understand, those crews took no action. On the shore, the Mont-Blanc crew again warned spectators to take cover. Then the crew members fled into the nearby woods. The tug, the Stella Maris, now free of the two scows she was pulling earlier, was the first vessel to arrive at the Mont-Blanc, ready to extinguish the fire. But the small stream of water produced by the Stella's water hoses did little against the raging fuel-fed flames. Commander in the British Royal Navy, T.K. Triggs of the HMS Highflyer, took charge of the situation. He ordered the Stella Maris to tow the Mont-Blanc further out into the channel, both to get it away from the pier and to provide more space for firefighting vessels. When the Stella attempted this maneuver, it was obvious to everyone watching that the 5-inch thick rope they were using would not be strong enough to move the Mont-Blanc. They were going to need a bigger rope. The terminal agent of the Canadian Government Railways, Henry Dustin, had an office just overlooking the pier. He received a call from William Lovett, the Richmond Railway chief clerk. "There's a steamer coming into the wharf on fire, loaded with explosives," Lovett told Dustin. "There's likely to be an explosion." Lovett prepared to evacuate the building. His train dispatcher, Vince Coleman, realized that a number of passenger and freight trains were due to arrive at Richmond Yard at nearby Pier 9 shortly. He sent a message out to all of the trains approaching Halifax. "Munitions ship on fire, making for Pier 6. Goodbye." That wasn't a typical sign-off. He knew this would be his last communication. Coleman's message was responsible for bringing all incoming trains around Halifax to a halt. It was heard by other stations all along the Intercolonial Railway, helping railway officials to respond immediately. Passenger train number 10, the overnight from St. John, heeded the warning and stopped a safe distance from the blast at Rockingham, saving the lives of about 300 railway passengers. Coleman was killed at his post as the explosion ripped through the city. He was honored with a Heritage Minute mini-documentary on the CBC in the 1990s and was inducted into the Canadian Railway Hall of Fame in 2004. On board the Mont-Blanc, when the benzol reached its boiling point of 176 degrees Fahrenheit, the barrels on top of the deck shot off like bottle rockets, displaying in green and pink lights. Many of the barrels came crashing straight back down on the deck. Either the explosion or the crash touched off a barrel of dry picric acid. At 9:04 and 35 seconds a.m., that barrel exploded throughout the hull of the ship, igniting the rest of the picric acid and the TNT. What resulted was the largest man-made explosion in history, right up to the detonation of the first atomic bomb in the Santa Fe Desert. The Mont-Blanc 7 million pounds of iron hull shot up over 1,000 feet into the air. At a temperature of over 9,000 degrees Fahrenheit, much of the hull just vaporized. The 1,100-pound anchor snapped from its chain and was thrown 2.35 miles away in a field near the neighborhood of Armdale. The rear cannon was blown 3 miles away and landed near a small lake on the Dartmouth side. White-hot fragments of the ship rained down on the streets of Halifax and Dartmouth. A slick black rain of burnt benzol then fell for the next 10 minutes. The blast wave from the explosion rushed out at over 13,000 miles per hour, far faster than the speed of sound. A blast wave being a wall of super-pressurized air that pushes everything out of its path. Those who witnessed it from a distance felt a deep rumbling in the ground before they heard the explosion. That explosion was so loud that people more than 230 miles away in Cape Breton Island and Prince Edward Island reported feeling it. One witness reported, "The concussion went right in you, like right in. You could feel it. You could feel it." Ginger Fraser, a student at Morris Street School, reported that her eyes were suddenly forced open wide by the air blast. Lottie Duggan said that her house just flew apart all at once. The blast wave knocked down buildings, toppled walls, shattered windows, and took down chimneys. The blast pulverized internal organs and collapsed the lungs and eardrums of nearby observers, while others were picked up and thrown against the nearest object. Houses in the area were crushed or collapsed. Floors dropped into basements, and families were trapped inside. An area of over 160 hectares, or 400 acres, was completely destroyed by the explosion, while the harbor floor was momentarily exposed by the volume of water that vaporized. A tsunami was formed by water surging in to fill the void. It rose as high as 18 meters, or 60 feet, above the high water mark on the Halifax side of the harbor. The Imo was carried onto the shore at Dartmouth by the tsunami. A fireball, invisible in the daylight, shot out over a 1 to 4 mile area surrounding the Mont-Blanc. Those houses that withstood the blast wave had their windows stretched inward until they broke, sending shards of sharp glass slicing through people's residences. This was particularly dangerous for many people who had stopped what they were doing that morning to watch the fire on the Mont-Blanc through their windows. Thousands of people were left blind by the blast. The fireball torched all objects in its path, destroying numerous homes and businesses. Stoves and lamps overturned by the force of the blast sparked other fires throughout Halifax, particularly in the North End, where entire city blocks were caught up in the inferno, trapping residents inside their houses. Firefighter Billy Wells, who was thrown away from the explosion and had his clothes torn from his body, described the devastation survivors faced. "The sight was awful, with people hanging out of windows dead, some with their heads missing, and some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires." He was the only member of the 8-man crew of the fire engine Patricia to survive. The blast wave also took all of the air with it, leaving behind a vacuum that exploded stoves, radiators, furnaces, and cupboards. Window glass exploded outward due to the pressurization. The blast killed all but one aboard a whaler sent out by the HMS High Flyer. Everyone aboard the steam pinnace sent out by the HMCS Niobe, and 21 of 26 of the men aboard the Stella Maris. She ended up on the Dartmouth shore, severely damaged. However, the crew member, who went to fetch a bigger rope, was shielded from the blast and did survive. The Imo, riddled with holes from flying metal, was hurled around on the Dartmouth shore by the tsunami. Captain Håkon Fromm and pilot William Hayes, as well as 5 crew members with them on the bridge, were killed by the blast. The blast and fireball killed and injured a great number of people near the harbor, taking down buildings and boats alike. But no one was prepared for or could have even expected the tsunami that occurred after the gaping hole in the harbor was refilled with water. Fireman Billy Wells, who had all of his clothing ripped off his body during the blast wave, was preparing to extinguish the burning ship. A massive piece of flesh had been torn off one arm, while his other arm was still clinging to the steering wheel of the fire truck Patricia. He was looking for the ship that had exploded when he caught sight of a giant wall of boiling water filled with chunks of wood and metal and dead fish heading straight for him. With no time to run, he let the water rush over him. When the water cleared, he was deposited yards away from where he had been standing. Wells described an awful sight from the field he landed in. People were hanging out of windows dead, some with their heads missing, some thrown onto the overhead telegraph wires. At St. Joseph's School, Helen Clark was sitting at her desk when the room went dark, and she could feel and hear a deep rumbling thunder coming up from the ground. She looked out the school window expecting a thunderstorm or blizzard. Instead, she saw the window panes bend toward her like a sail filled with wind. She wrapped her arms around her head and ducked. Thousands of glass shards shot across the room like daggers. When it had stopped, there was blood streaming down her face. She and a classmate ran for the door. The ceiling above gave way at one corner and down two sides of the room, hanging like the flap of a great envelope and spilling out children from the room above, she said. She was suddenly grabbed at the wrist by a large hand, which she instantly recognized as one of the sisters at the Catholic school. "My heavenly God," the sister said, "the Germans have arrived. Get down on your knees, girls." The people of Halifax and Dartmouth were affected in various ways by the multi-pronged disaster. Frank Hillis, a 14-year-old, was home sick with the measles. The blast wave collapsed the house on top of Frank. His brother Gordon was blown straight through the window and out into the yard. Frank was trapped beneath the house until his father George came to rescue him. George had passed many wounded people pleading for his assistance on the way to his home, but he was determined to secure the safety of his family first. Frank had a broken arm and was bleeding badly, and his eyes were so damaged that he could not see. George's brother Bert lived next door. His house also collapsed on top of him, as well as his son Laurie, an infant daughter. Laurie did not survive, and George cradled him in his arms until he died. Bert's wife Helen, who was on her way to visit friends, had died instantly in the blast. Frank Sr., George, and Bert's father died when the blast slammed the door to the company vault shut and trapped him inside. He was discovered the next day. At the Hillis foundry, 2 out of 3 employees were killed when molten lead spilled over the floors and the walls shook to the ground. At the factory next door, only 3 workers survived because they had been sent on errands. Frank's mother, his aunt, and their friend Ethel Bowen were all standing on the same veranda at the time of the blast. Only Frank's mother survived. Ethel was cut in 2 by a door jamb. His aunt was found dead on a street corner, while his mother was found alive, pinned beneath a lamppost. The effects of the blast seemed completely random. The first responders were the surviving residents and workers in the Halifax area. They pulled and dug out victims from buildings. They were soon joined by surviving policemen, firefighters, and military personnel. Also enlisted was anyone with a working vehicle. Cars, trucks, and delivery wagons of all kinds were enlisted to collect the wounded. The city's hospitals were soon overwhelmed with victims. The new military hospital, Camp Hill, admitted more than 1,400 victims just on the first day. Royal Navy cruisers in port sent some of the first organized rescue parties ashore. The HMS Flyer, along with the armed merchant cruiser HMS Changuinola, HMS Knight Templar, and HMS Calgarian, sent boats ashore with rescue parties and medical personnel who transported the wounded to those vessels for proper care. A U.S. Coast Guard cutter, the U.S. C.G. Morrell, also sent a rescue party ashore. Out at sea, the American cruiser USS Tacoma was passing Halifax en route to the United States. The American steamship Old Colony docked in Halifax for repairs, suffered little damage, and was quickly converted to serve as a hospital ship staffed by doctors and orderlies from the British and American Navy vessels in the harbor. Many of the stunned survivors immediately feared that the explosion was the result of a bomb dropped from a German plane. Troops stationed at gun batteries and barracks immediately turned out in case the city was under attack. But within an hour, switched from defense to rescue roles as it became clear that the blast wasn't war-related. All available troops were called in from the nearby fortifications and barracks to rescue survivors and provide transport to the city's hospitals. Rescue trains were dispatched from across Atlantic Canada, as well as the northeastern United States. The first supply train from Truro arrived in Halifax by noon and returned to Truro with the wounded and homeless by 3 p.m. Rail passage in and around Halifax had become extremely difficult, if not impossible. To reach the wounded, rescue personnel had to walk through parts of the devastated city until they reached a point where the military had begun to clear the streets. By nightfall, more than a dozen trains arrived from the surrounding area. Relief efforts were hampered the following day by a blizzard that covered Halifax with 16 inches of heavy snow. Trains en route from other parts of Canada and from the U.S. stalled in snowdrifts, while telegraph lines, just repaired following the explosion, were knocked down in the blizzard. Halifax was isolated by the storm, and rescue committees were forced to suspend the search for survivors. On the positive side, the snowstorm put out the many fires. According to the Halifax Explosion Remembrance Book by the Nova Scotia Archives and Records Management Office, 1,950 people died as a result of the Halifax explosion, whether it was in the blast, the building collapses, the tsunami, or the resulting fires. An additional 9,000 were injured, and the care of those injured would have strained local resources had it not been for a national and international relief effort. 1,630 homes were destroyed and another 12,000 damaged. Roughly 6,000 people were left homeless and 25,000 had insufficient shelter. Keep in mind, Halifax only had a population of 50,000 at the time. The city's industrial sector was in large part gone, with many workers among the casualties and the dockyard heavily damaged. Many of the wounded were permanently debilitated by the blast. That included injuries caused by flying glass or by the fire flash of the explosion. Thousands of people stopped to watch the ship burn in the harbor while looking through windows inside buildings and homes. That put them directly in the path of glass fragments from those shattered windows. Roughly 5,900 eye injuries were reported, and 41 people lost their sight permanently. At the time of the explosion, there was a small First Nations community of Micmac living on the shores of the Bedford Basin on the Dartmouth side. All of the housing in this settlement was obliterated by the fire and tsunami. At least 9 bodies were recovered. More may have died. The settlement was never rebuilt. The black community of Africville, also located on the Bedford side shore, was mostly spared from the direct blast, but did suffer 5 fatalities and significant structural damage. That community was also not rebuilt. But Halifax was rebuilt, and today is a large municipality of more than 400,000 people with a thriving harbor and shipyard. 30 years and 2 wars later, a French registered Liberty ship, named the Grandcamp, was docked in the port town of Texas City, Texas, located 37 miles southeast of Houston and 10 miles northwest of Galveston. Longshoremen, or stevedores, whichever you prefer, were loading the last hold of the transport ship, which already contained 2,300 tons of cargo. Built as part of a massive fleet of transports by the U.S. during World War II, the 7,000-ton Liberties were large and constructed to withstand the rigors of warfare. After the war, the ships were decommissioned and used for peacetime transport. For this trip, the Grandcamp had a French crew and a captain by the name of Charles de Guillebon. On the morning of April 16, 1947, the ship was mostly loaded and preparing for a long journey back to France. Already on board was a varied cargo of compressed cotton, sisal twine, tobacco, shelled peanuts, agricultural machinery, and 16 cases of small arms ammunition. Last to go into the cargo hold was 2,200 tons of ammonium nitrate, which can be used as either a fertilizer or an explosive. In this case, the ammonium nitrate was being sent to Europe as a fertilizer to assist in the rebuilding effort following the war. The Grandcamp was originally going to take on the ammonium nitrate cargo in Houston, but was banned from doing so by the port there due to the compound's volatility. Because of rainy weather, it had taken several days to load this cargo. Docked about 600 feet away was the SS High Flyer. Yes, That's a different high flyer than the one in Halifax. I wish the ship namers had been a little more creative that day. This high flyer was loaded with 960 tons of ammonium nitrate and 1,800 tons of sulfur. The ammonium nitrate was stored in paper sacks for transport and stored in regular facilities, where the temperature allowed an increase in chemical activity. That morning, the stevedores loading the sacks of ammonium nitrate reported that they were warm to the touch. In the investigations that followed, none of the stevedores reported being warned of the explosive properties of ammonium nitrate, and in fact, a representative of the manufacturer told an executive at the railway company that transported the sacks to Texas City that the sacks contained no explosive material. Ammonium nitrate will actually explode at the right temperature and was in fact used at the Oklahoma City bombing in 1995. That morning at 8 o'clock, the dock crew entered Hold 4 to load the remainder of the ammonium nitrate cargo. Upon entering that hold, 4 workers detected the smell of smoke. Julio Luna and Bill Thompson located a blue plume rising near the skin of the ship on the inshore side. They removed several bags to get a better glimpse of the source of the smoke. What they saw was a small fire about 10 to 15 feet below and out of their reach. They called for water to extinguish the fire. 2 jugs of drinking water produced, but when the water was used to put out the fire, it only served to spread the fire to other sacks. At this point, members of the French crew took notice and responded by bringing 2 soda acid fire extinguishers. But hitting the flames with the contents of the fire extinguishers only seemed to make the fire burn faster. The workers were growing more concerned. A fire hose was lowered into the hold, but it was not turned on. As the fire grew and the smoke thickened, gang foreman Leonard Boswell ordered the stevedores onto the deck. They were met by an officer of the ship, probably Gillibon. The officer stated in English that he did not want any more water used to put out the fire because it would ruin the cargo. Instead, he wanted to use steam to smother the fire. This was a common practice at the time. However, the decision was made apparently without knowledge of the chemical properties of the cargo. The hatches were battened down and the ventilators were closed. Almost immediately, the hatch cover for Hold 4 jerked up and down like it was possessed by a hostile spirit. Orders were given to remove the ammunition, but were rescinded when it was determined that Hold 4 was too hot for human entry. At 8:30, the terminal railway, the lead authority at the port, sounded a siren and the stevedores were ordered off the ship. Some stayed nearby, while others drove to the Union Hall across town to await new instructions. Most of the Grandcamp's crew also left the ship at this time. A call was put out for tugboats to pull the ship out of the harbor and for a fireboat to extinguish the flames. At 8:45, 4 fire trucks appeared on the scene with 27 firefighters. They would be joined by 2 more trucks. The thermal decomposition of the burning ammonium nitrate was well advanced. As hoses were being connected to hydrants, the hatch on Hold 4 blew several feet into the air. Reddish-brown smoke billowed out of the hatch. At this point, if the firemen had sprayed the ship with their hoses, the water would have vaporized. Tom Womack, an engineer at the nearby Monsanto chemical plant, remarked to a colleague from his office window, "That ship's got ammonium nitrate on it, and it's going to blow up." As plumes of orange smoke rose up in the morning sky, onlookers rushing to view the fire blocked the streets leading to the harbor. By 9 o'clock, several hundred people had gathered to watch the beautiful smoke rise from the burning cargo ships. Most of them had no business at the piers. By 9:12 a.m., some spectators had started turning away, figuring that the fire would soon be put out. Swede Sandberg, the vice president at Terminal Railways, notified Lykes Brothers Steamship Lines that their ship, the High Flyer, was in no danger from the burning ship. At that moment, the temperature of the ammonium nitrate in the Grandcamp reached a critical state and the ship exploded. Willie D. Chris looked out her bedroom window and said that she saw a wall of fire, with curtain-like streaks of red, yellow, and white heat with black lacy edges on top. John Home, another resident, said he could see debris and bodies flying through the air, as well as the dark ridge of the blast wave just before it hit his house. Frank Woodyard, a crew member on the Wilson B. Keene, remembered a heavy bombardment. a dull rumble and rolling and cracking and crashing which lasted 10 seconds. A giant cloud of black smoke rose 2,000 feet into the air as flaming balls of sisal twine and cotton rained down with metal pieces of shrapnel. The blast wave and shrapnel brought death and injury to those in close vicinity to the Grand Camp. The explosion leveled nearly 1,000 buildings in Texas City. It destroyed the Monsanto Chemical Company plant and resulted in the ignition of refineries and chemical tanks on the waterfront. The Grand Camp's anchor was hurled across the city. 2 sightseeing airplanes flying nearby had their wings shorn off, forcing them out of the sky. 10 miles or 16 kilometers away, people in Galveston were rocked to their knees. The explosion blew almost 6,350 tons of the ship's steel into the air, some of it at supersonic speed. The sound of the explosion was loud enough to be heard over 400 miles away in Louisiana, and it set off a seismograph machine in Denver, Colorado. More than 100 people who were standing on the docks completely disappeared without a trace, including all of the 27 men in the fire company. The explosion also created a huge wall of water over 15 feet high that swept survivors off the docks and tossed a 150-foot steel hydrochloric acid barge weighing 30 tons more than 100 feet inland where it rested next to a portion of the Grand Camp frame, while a 20-ton section of the Grand Camp landed more than 2,500 feet away. The shrapnel from the ship may have caused more injuries and damage than the blast itself. The white-hot bits of shrapnel rained down on the many oil storage tanks standing at the harbor, setting some of those on fire. While blast injuries and drowning caused most of the deaths, just as in Halifax, many people died of injuries suffered from flying glass and collapsing buildings. And just as in Halifax, many of the survivors and witnesses thought they had been attacked, this time by the Russians, dropping an atomic bomb. The blast wave also had one other important effect. It tore the high flyer from its mooring at Pier A, just to the north of where the Grand Camp had been. It drifted across the main slip and lodged against the ship, the Wilson B. Keene. Its hatches had been blown off and its engines wrecked by the explosion. The uninjured crew members worked to secure their vessel to the Keene to stop it from drifting, while the nearby docks and warehouses continued to burn. Explosions along the waterfront from these burning facilities caused the cargo in the high flyer to ignite. Her captain, Mosley Peterman, ordered his crew to abandon ship. There had been several unsuccessful attempts to relocate the Keene and the high flyer, but the fires and the obstacles created by the blast prevented those ships from being moved to a safe location. Shortly after midnight the next day, balls of fire began shooting out of the holds of the high flyer. Just as the tugboats were given the command to cut the tow ropes after several failed attempts to move the vessel, the high flyer exploded. A huge column of red flame billowed several thousand feet into the air. Fiery balls peeled off from the main column of smoke, while hot shrapnel arched out from the top in a giant fireworks display. The ship disintegrated into thousands of small pieces, which were thrown as far as 6,000 feet away. Casualties were lighter following the second blast. Most of the dock area had been cleared of non-essential personnel. There were no curious onlookers, and just about all the businesses were closed at such an early hour. 2 people were killed and 24 injured in the high flyer blast. One of those killed was Father William Loach, who had been working long into the night to help the injured. The other was student mortician Charles Kelly, who was assisting with collecting the dead. Structures that had been standing, or partially standing, were flattened by this second blast, and new fires started in the petroleum storage tanks. The explosion of the high flyer had capped off a tremendously devastating 24 hours in Texas City. The Texas City disaster is generally considered the worst industrial accident in American history. Of the dead, 405 were identified, and 63 have never been identified. There is some speculation that there may have been hundreds more killed but uncounted, including visiting seamen, non-census laborers, and their families, and an untold number of travelers. More than 5,000 people were injured, with 1,784 admitted to 21 area hospitals. More than 500 homes were destroyed and hundreds damaged, leaving 2,000 homeless. The seaport was destroyed, and many businesses were flattened or burned. Over 1,100 vehicles were damaged, and 362 freight cars were obliterated. The property damage was estimated at $100 million, or $1.07 billion U.S. in today's terms. Returning to Halifax, it did not take the province of Nova Scotia very long to begin their inquiry. On December 12, 1917, just 6 days after the explosion and resulting catastrophe, Justice Arthur Drysdale of the Nova Scotia Supreme Court presided over the inquiry in the boarded-up courthouse in central Halifax. The hospitals were overflowing, victims were dying, fires were still smoldering, and not all of the bodies had been found. But the Canadian public demanded answers. The Mont-Blanc pilot, Francis Mackey, and the Imo captain, Aim Lemedek, appeared, but William Hayes, the pilot of the Imo, was not there since he died in the incident. During the trial, it came to light that the Imo had left Bedford Basin and entered the Narrows without permission from the port authorities. The authorities were well aware of the contents of the Mont-Blanc and wanted it to have clear, unencumbered passage, but testimony revealed that the pilots often dodged some of the rules and acted on their own initiative. It also became clear that the port authorities were not always easy to reach. A 16-year-old clerk testified that he gave up on passing messages to his superiors because they weren't paying attention. The inquiry took more than 1 year. It found the pilot and captain of the Mont-Blanc solely responsible for violating the rules. Mackey and Lemedek were both arrested, but charges of manslaughter were later dropped. An appeal to the Supreme Court of Canada ended in a split decision. In 1920, the case was brought before the Privy Council in London, the ultimate authority on such matters. They found that the Mont-Blanc and Imo were both equally to blame. Mackey, Lemedek, and Port Commander Wyatt continued their careers. The Imo was recommissioned as a whaler and struck a rock and sank just off the Falkland Islands 4 years after the explosion in Halifax. The findings by the inquiry may have focused too much on determining subjects to blame for the explosion, rather than examining all of the elements and circumstances that led to the disaster. I will get to those shortly. In 1948, the National Board of Fire Underwriters published their findings regarding the ship explosions at Texas City. Of primary concern was the carelessly discarded cigarette. But investigators found that every common fire safety rule was being violated. One dock worker testified that it was typical practice to treat each sack of ammonium nitrate like it was a bag of cement. The ammonium nitrate sacks were only marked as fertilizer with no mention of their volatility. Broken sacks were not reported or separated. Other bags were piled on top of or next to the ammonium nitrate with no concern for chemical properties. Bag leakage was not reported. There was no concern for temperature or humidity in terms of storage. There was no regard for zinc coating in the storage holds, although zinc can cause an exothermic reaction with ammonium nitrate, and no action was taken when warehouse workers reported the sacks were warm to the touch. Also, the ship's fuel supply was located next to hold number 4, where the ammonium nitrate was stored, and may have contributed to the intense heat of the fire, which was the cause of the ammonium nitrate exploding. The report found that the fire could have been extinguished by deluging the material with heavy streams of water. The report concludes by stating that the disaster was needless and preventable, and called for responsible authorities to, wait for it, establish a major disaster plan, gearing up all vital emergency services, and arrange for mutual aid with nearby communal centers. Exactly the type of thing we advocate on the Podcast of Doom. Halifax and Texas City provide two excellent examples of the same disaster, a ship loaded with explosive material blowing up with different causes. In the case of Halifax, the problem was not so much in the handling of the material. Everyone loading it and everyone transporting the cargo on the Mont-Blanc knew they were handling highly volatile substances that would blow sky high with just a jolt from the wrong direction. The Mont-Blanc's cargo was loaded with great care. The people responsible knew picric acid, TNT, and gun cotton were volatile and could explode if not correctly handled. They also knew that the benzol was highly flammable, and if it caught fire, it would be just a matter of time until the other cargo blew up and blew up big. The greater problem was that the contents of the Mont-Blanc was not communicated appropriately to the relevant people. Normally, a cargo ship transporting explosives into Halifax harbor was required to fly a red flag, but this requirement was waived for the Mont-Blanc. Other errors were caused by the pilot of the Imo in not taking appropriate actions to correct his course and traveling above the allowed speed limit, not to mention refusing to take an order from another ship that had the obligation to deliver the order. The port was lax in enforcing rules and procedures put in place to avoid such accidents, and they were responsible for not keeping the channel clear for the safe passage of the Mont-Blanc. In Texas City, there were no problems concerning navigation. The ship was docked in port. The biggest problem was the lax handling of the cargo. Ammonium nitrate, as mentioned, could be used as either fertilizer or explosive, but its latter role was downplayed, and most of the important players, the crew, the dock workers, the businesses around the dock, and the ship's captain, would have behaved differently if they knew the volatility of their cargo. 2 years after the end of World War II, the people responsible for maintaining safety of the ship and harbor had let their guard down with fatal consequences. The person who discarded the cigarette also must share some blame for being so careless, and rules should have been in place to prevent smoking in cargo holds in the first place. The captain also shares in the blame for attempting to save his cargo rather than considering safety first when he ordered the fire to be extinguished by steam rather than from water with pressurized hoses. There was also a general lax approach to handling the fire when it first became visible, and this also contributed to the disaster. Both of these disasters were slow-moving in nature, and each could have been avoided if the captains of the involved ships took evasive actions earlier than they did. Now, about the development of those cargo transport ships, they continue to grow bigger and faster and faster. The largest container ship in the world is the OOCL Hong Kong. That ship is 400 meters or 1,300 feet long, 60 meters or nearly 200 feet wide. It can transport nearly 300,000 tons of cargo, or 21,500 TEUs, or 20-foot equivalent units, which are those generic metal cargo containers that you see moving from ship to train to truck. Traveling at 16 to 25 knots, it can make the trip from Shanghai to Rotterdam in the Netherlands in 36 days, hitting 12 ports along the way. If you live near busy ports like I do in Vancouver, Canada, and Seattle, Washington, you can see them lined up coming in and going out all day. And that represents a lot of stuff being traded. Thank you for joining me for the Podcast of Doom. Please feel free to comment regarding your thoughts by emailing me at podcastofdoom@aol.com or visit me at www.thepodcastofdoom.com. I would like to remind listeners that I am an active member of Dark Myths, a collective of podcasters dedicated to exploring the dark side of life. I would like to give a shout out to some of the other Dark Myths podcasts, such as the Nighttime Podcast, about Canadian true crime, mysteries, and weird events, which happens to be based in today's topic city of Halifax, Nova Scotia. Also, Wittenberg to Westphalia, The Wars of the Reformation, the Astonishing Legends podcast, the Secret Cabinet, a German podcast about strange legends, the History of Alchemy podcast, which will tell you everything you ever wanted to know about alchemy, and Pete's Paranormal Chronicles. You can check us out at www.darkmyths.org. Next week, we will examine the life and times of Vlad Dracula Tepes. Yes, he was a real person who lived in Romania, or Wallachia to be precise, during the 15th century. He did not spend much time drinking the blood of his victims in order to live an immortal life, as that would have gotten in the way of his side hobby of impalement. Idle hands being the devil's workshop. Until then, keep your ears pinned and your tail taut.